This is where architecture takes time. This is where you have to be trained to think like an architect, much like you have to be trained to think like a doctor or a lawyer. Think through the process. How do you get to the result, and what's the path you take to get there? It's not all whimsy and it's not all flippant. It has to be, at the end of the day, purposeful if you want to accomplish something that's better than something else, that's memorable. There are no memorable accidents. I don't think it's possible. You can't make a building that's memorable by accident unless you're really lucky. I don't know many architects that are lucky. Most of the best and greatest architects that we look up to, that we refer to today, are very cognitive about the way they think through a process.
David Wagner is an architect and an artist. His creations tell stories that invite listening and conversation. His projects range from retail and office complexes, restaurants and corporate headquarters, urban parks and public spaces, commercial buildings and markets, streetscapes, multimodal stations, and centers of art, galleries, and museums. He has designed interiors of several stadiums for the National Football League, including Raymond James Stadium, Bank of America Stadium, Lucas Oil Stadium, and Heinz Field. From large mixed-use planning to designs for chairs and bar stools and dinnerware, David Wagner makes spaces and places memorable. He is a painter, a sculptor, a gardener, an inventor, and a prolific writer. Over a 40-year career, his voice has led discourse about cities and the public realm. David, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
It's great to have you, David. David, how do you describe what you do?
I can probably start with a quote. All good things come by grace, and grace comes by art, and art does not come easy.
Well, that's a wonderful quote, but what does that mean?
It means exactly what it says. In order to have grace, you have to have some kind of artistic temperament, and without it, it's hard to do.
As a profession, you're an architect.
Correct.
What do you do as an architect?
I design buildings, primarily.
What kind of buildings do you design?
Usually what the client brings to us. We are not heavily into marketing our services, as so many firms are, and we have reached a level of success by sort of self-marketing and not necessarily repeating things over and over again, but maintaining a good client base, and that serves us well. We obviously would love to have more creative projects, but the question is, how do you go out into the marketplace and continue to strive to do that? We've had great clients, we've done good buildings, and we hope to endeavor to keep doing that.
What are some types of projects that you've worked on over the years?
We've worked on everything from small coffee shops to professional football stadiums, so the range is great. The scale changes, but I don't believe you necessarily have to change your way of thinking to change a scale. The details that you might see in a coffee shop are not dissimilar from the kind of finite details you might see in a stadium. What you want to try to do as an architect, in my parlance, is to make someone who experiences what you do seem like a seamless experience, meaning when you walk into a space, you're comfortable in the environment that has been created. As you know, you can go in a number of buildings that make you feel extremely uncomfortable. I can tell you that for a fact because I travel a lot, and I go into a lot of buildings in a lot of places, and some buildings have a tendency to change your feelings, affect the way you respond to them. Sometimes not always positive, other times perhaps. Give you an example. We were in Denver a few weeks ago, and we went to the old renovated Union Station, which is a delightful neoclassical building built turn of the century, completely restored. Now it's a food court. A pleasant place to be in, high ceiling, vaulted ceiling, lots of activity, and just bright light and dynamic. Then we crossed the street and went over to the Denver Museum of Contemporary Art. I spent less than 5 minutes in that building, and it's brand new. Uncomfortable, disconcerting, discontinuous, confusing. And I thought to myself, I'm an architect, so perhaps I'm responding differently, like an architect might, as opposed to, say, someone, a patron or even a visitor. And but I believe it was in the way the building was put together. It didn't invite you. It didn't say, here, come in and visit me. Come in and stay, ponder, look at the art. So, it's perhaps it's a trick of the way of the trade and the way I've been trained is the way I look at things. Whether old or new, there are great new buildings. There are great old buildings. There are also bad old buildings and bad new buildings.
So you're looking for a qualitative feeling of comfort
Correct.
when you walk into a space.
Yes, or experience something that makes you think about it again. Not all things you do are memorable, as you well know. But my feeling is that as an architect, I do have a responsibility to at least attempt to make something memorable.
What is the process of architecture from engagement to delivery? If I were to retain you as an architect, what steps do you go through?
It's sort of to each their own. That's a hard question to answer, Mark. And the reason is we've had clients who have come to us and said, just do whatever you want to do. So you don't have the, if you will, the time or the inclination or the acceptance to analyze the problem carefully or ask the pertinent questions. What is it you're looking for? Other clients are very analytical to the point where it can be very frustrating working with them, where you feel you've accomplished something, but it just wasn't enough. And we do try to take every step to listen carefully to clients and have a favorable result.
How would I know that I'm looking at a David Wagner designed building? Is there a signature to your work?
No signature. I think the best architecture in the world is contextual architecture. Not to say there aren't great buildings. The Louvre is a great building, the Louvre. The Eiffel Tower is a great iconic monument. Those kinds of things are one-off, have a major effect, a memorable effect. Most buildings do not, and it's okay. If you travel a lot, particularly to older European cities, the only standout buildings in European towns and cities usually were the cathedrals, religious edifices, were the ones that said, we are the center of town. Occasionally government buildings, but not to the degree that religious buildings took a precedent in town planning for many, many years. The City Beautiful movement in the United States at the turn of the century attempted to replicate or emulate grand planning, like the Grand Palais in Paris or in France. And Chicago achieved it to a certain degree, and it's a pretty grand city, but that was because they were thinking about how to make it a special place. Washington, D.C. is an example. The mall is a grand design, very European, very un-American. But nonetheless, those types of planning can be very effective and memorable.
Are you generally a fan of central planning or master planning?
I am a fan of thoughtful planning.
Do you see more examples of thoughtful planning or not?
Not. Usually not. Unfortunately, it's a go-go society, go-go culture. Everything has to be done instantaneously. Thinking is not necessarily a requirement today to be a successful architect or designer. I do have a frustration about the way we perceive and do projects today, and our clients are part of the problem because we have developed technology where everything can be instantaneous. It's all Photoshop. So if a client comes to us today and says, Dave, I need a building by next week, I can produce one, but it's a Photoshop building. It's quick, as we call it in the industry, done and dirty, and we respond. Is it always good? I don't know. Is it bad? Maybe not. But you don't have the time to think things through, which I think is unfortunate. And you can tell this by what I'll call the papier-mâché architecture we tend to build today. It all goes up very quickly.
What makes for a great architect?
Persistence and determination, a belief system, a desire to make something that has a lasting value. That's what makes a great architect. And you know all the guys that did that, from Frank Lloyd Wright to Corbusier to modernist architects to classical architects to Renaissance architects. They were motivated by one thing: beauty, lasting beauty. And to the degree that it is in the eye of the beholder, there's no question about it. But who can doubt that Chartres is not a beautiful building? It doesn't really matter who you are or where you come from. You will be in awe of that structure. Now, we can't continuously attempt to replicate iconic buildings. It actually makes no sense. Cities don't need to be a museum of great buildings. Cities need to have a context that makes a pedestrian, a citizen, a resident feel comfortable in the environment that has been created. And as you know, cities are ever changing.
There's an axiom in architecture: if you want a great building, get a great client. What makes for a great client?
A client who listens and allows the architect to think, sometimes outside the box or within a strict set of programmatic guidelines. It's okay. You can make good buildings if a good client allows you to do it. Yeah, and I also think, I don't want to be too simplistic about it, I think you have to have a certain talent before you just step into this profession. Otherwise, you do tend to reduce yourself to the mundane, and hopefully, I don't try to do that.
When you hire young architects, what do you look for?
Just a lot of energy, creativity, and believe it or not, we still look for the ability to actually draw. I know this sounds crazy, but I understand I'm not connected to colleges much anymore, but I understand a lot of curriculum today does not center on understanding two-dimensional and three-dimensional drawing.
Can a talent for design be taught?
Yes and no. It's the right brain, left brain thing. I think you are born with an innate ability to be creative. What you can do is nurture the creativity. And if you look at the biographies of architects or artists or people in the artistic fields, they will tell you that from a young age they were inspired by certain things that allowed their creativity to grow. They were given the tools, so to speak, to be able to nurture it. If you have a great mind and never went to school, never saw the inside of an institution, how could you become an architect? Or for that matter, a doctor or anything else? So it's in you, but you have to have a way to get it out.
Are there great new buildings that are being built today that inspire you?
I think there are good buildings being done. How they inspire me is a different thing. I think I'm fairly set in the way I approach a problem and a solution to a problem. I might look at a building and say it has certain interesting aspects or features, and then attempt to think about them when I do a building. It is very difficult today to have complete originality in anything because there's so much precedent. And if you have a memory, and most of us do, and if you use your memory, it's packed full of stuff. And when I think of a building, I can see a zillion buildings in my head, not literally, but figuratively. Someone says, let's design a library. You start thinking about libraries. Automatically, your brain starts going to, gee, what was the last library I had seen that looked good? So we do have to use the resources we have. The trick is if you can take all that information and turn it into something that is plausibly and effectively different.
Is the final measure for you memorability?
Yes, I think without a memory, it's tough to be in this business. I think it's tough to be anywhere. I think memory is always in the present, not the past. Although people say, I remember when. What you're really saying is, I'm thinking about that right now. And that memory is aiding your current and present thinking.
And the measure for you of a great building ultimately is that it is memorable.
It is memorable. Or a city, or a place. Place can be memorable. Physical spaces can be memorable. Buildings can be memorable. You know this. Yes.
When you look at a building, what do you notice?
Everything. The scale, the proportion, the details, the size of the windows, how many doors it has, what's in front of it, what the sidewalk looks like that connects it. I look at everything.
Is it the beauty that attracts you first or the imperfections?
It's not the imperfections. I never seek the imperfections. I seek the details. Whether they're perfect or imperfect is not for me to judge. I just look at the building and think, this was well thought out, well put together, well detailed, or not so well detailed.
When you are designing, is there an ideal form, a line, a shape, a sense of volume that continuously attracts you? Is there an ideal in architecture that you are drawn to?
Some architects would tell you Euclidean geometry, the beauty of geometry. But having thought about that and having taken a number of courses in college where we did the beauty and the dignity of mathematics, it does allow you to think more three-dimensionally about things.
Do you think mathematically when you design?
I do. I think sometimes in proportions, and I think in rhythm, and I think in progression. Space to space to space, volume to volume, and all that is basically geometric.
David, you grew up in Pittsburgh. What was your life like growing up?
As far as I knew, it was a great life. I never knew any other life, so it was fine. I enjoyed growing up in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is a terrific old city. It is a memorable place. Pittsburgh's got a lot of density. It's got a lot of culture, character, lots of different nationalities and personalities.
What neighborhood did you grow up in Pittsburgh?
I was born and raised in downtown Pittsburgh, literally in the city. Mm-hmm. When we were older, we moved to the suburbs like everyone else. But and I enjoy going back to Pittsburgh. Years ago, I was invited back to work on Heinz Field for the Pittsburgh Steelers. It was a terrific time for me to come back after 30 years and work on a project in Pittsburgh.
How would others have described you as a teenager?
Reckless, volatile, and inconsistent, and I was never very focused when I was in high school.
Is there something about Pittsburgh as a place that you carry with you today as an architect?
Yes, the city has a perfect pedestrian scale.
Explain.
It's small, for one. It's a compact city. Happens to be surrounded by 3 rivers that make a Y. The scale and the proportion of the streets and the buildings are very comfortable. And I think of Pittsburgh often when I think of urban planning. Lots of open space, public space, well integrated into the design. You have to understand something about Pittsburgh, which is unique in this country, maybe different only than perhaps the big industrialist cities such as New York and Chicago. But Pittsburgh had more industrialists and more money and more concentrated wealth at the turn of the century than any city in the United States. Steel, coke, coal, glass, iron ore, all of that was there. These industrialists invested heavily in Pittsburgh. They created public parks. Schenley Park is a perfect example. It's about 200 or 300 acres. It was given to the city of Pittsburgh by Andrew Carnegie's nemesis, Frick. But that's Pittsburgh.
David, you attended Virginia Tech University College of Architecture. What do you remember about your time as a student?
I remember Virginia Tech when I first arrived. I came from Pennsylvania, so it was culturally unique to me to come to Virginia Tech. I did not understand a word anyone said because they had an extreme Southern accent. So I was clearly a fish out of water when I arrived. However, Virginia Tech at the time I attended was bucolic. It was in the foothills of the mountains of Western Virginia, beautifully set, beautifully situated, just an absolutely gorgeous campus. And I could understand why you would fall in love with those kinds of places. I also was motivated by the curriculum. When I visited, I had an opportunity to go into the College of Architecture, and I had architectural training before I went to Virginia Tech, and met some professors and walked away not just impressed, but also excited about this would be a neat place to go to school.
One of your instructors was Olivio Ferrari. Who was he and what was notable about him?
He was notable because he, first of all, was Italian, Swiss Italian. And as you know, Switzerland's divided into 3 sort of separate pieces of pie, Italian, German, and French. He was from the Italian section of Switzerland, which is southern, the Ticino region. And he was schooled in the Bauhaus tradition. And when he came to America, he similarly had language problems. He did not speak English when he arrived. This I understood later on. But what I liked about Ferrari was his desire to instill in students the ability to be, if you decide to be an architect, you can do anything you want to do. You don't just have to be an architect. But if you get a good design education, you can parlay that into just about any field. And I think he's right. I learned how to design furniture with Ferrari. I learned how to do graphic design with Ferrari. I learned how to design buildings with Ferrari. I learned a lot of things. You know, we were blessed and lucky at the time that he was there. And those that understood him and garnered from him what he was attempting to do, you could take it with you the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Early in your career, you were part of a team that submitted a design for the Vietnam Memorial. Your team won a meritorious award. When you see Maya Lin's memorial, what do you see?
Hers is better than ours. There even is. And again, I'm not saying what we did wasn't okay, because it did, out of 1,600 entries, it was shortlisted. So that's a positive thing. And it included water, moving water. And moving water, as you know, is tranquil and peaceful. And when we were thinking about the tragedy of that war, and by the way, I was at the time, the draft ended, and the draft was a lottery. So I was clearly eligible to go to Vietnam. But nonetheless, when we designed the project, we were thinking about that the takeaway from the Vietnam War, in my opinion, at the time, was that it was a tragic event in American culture and life. And the way we wanted to think about it was try to make something peaceful about it, even though it wasn't in any way peaceful. The reason Lynn's project is so more profound is she effectively cut a wedge in the ground and said, we need to kill bad habits. And killing bad habits is bad wars, and wars that are unnecessary. So symbolically, she had a much better idea. Put the sword in the ground and end the tragedy.
You're a fan of great popular music, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, David Bowie. Is there anything you hear in certain songs that inform your work as an architect?
I have to be honest about the song thing. I do have a lot of songs I like, and I do memorize the lyrics to just about every song I hear. The truth of the fact is this: I don't listen to music much anymore, but I did years ago, like anyone. I mean, think about the way we grew up. We had only a radio. We had a TV with 4 stations, 3 national broadcast stations and PBS. If you wanted to send something, it was a fax machine or mail, and you had a landline and a record player. Usually it played 45 and 33 and a half. So you went out and bought a tune, and records cost a few bucks, and you listened to the radio. And you went out with your friends and you sang songs, so you memorized all the songs. When I was in college, we used to have certain nights where we would play only one rock star or one event. We would have Neil Young nights. So in the studio, you could only play Neil Young. If someone else put something else on, you said, get that damn thing off there. This is Neil Young. Tomorrow's Dylan. So this is the way we grew up. But what I tie to popular music is, again, goes back to memory. I tie a song to an event, what I might have been doing at the time. And I can remember distinctly listening to a certain rock star and designing a certain building. And to this day, I equate what I designed with who I was listening to at the time. But today, I really don't listen to much music anymore.
You were the local architect of record working with Mario Botta on the Beckler Museum of Modern Art. For those unfamiliar with the building, how would you describe it?
The building is an event. And the genius in the building was Botta's ability to take a very small program. It's only 35,000 square feet, which is smaller than a lot of rooms in most big museums. And the way he stacked the building and created this cantilevered porch-like space that was this covered canopy, which drew you to the building. It is impossible to walk by that building and not be drawn to its front door, even if you don't even know what it is. There is a key to the success of a great building, is you subconsciously relate to it. And then as soon as you subconsciously relate to it, you consciously engage it.
How does an architect design for that subconscious engagement?
Because he's thinking about the experience of what it would be like, and that is a trained ability. You would, if you design enough buildings and you're a thoughtful, thought-provoking architect, you will think about ways to make the subconscious experience turn into a conscious one.
Tell us more about that building for those who may not know it.
Well, the materiality of the building is unique. It's made out of clay tile, one of Mario Botta's favorite materials, which gives it a certain patina and hue. You know, it looks like the Italian plant pot in your back porch. Same material, same clay. It's a welcoming space. It's layered nicely, and to the point where the layout, if you will, the circulation of the building compels you to want to move through it. These things are hard to do in buildings. It's not always easy or obvious. And I think that is clearly the success of the building. And of course, the fact that it sits well in a streetscape that is pretty monotonous. It does stand out, but it stands out in a rather humble way. It doesn't cry out and say, you must see me, but in a certain way, it is unavoidable, to not pay attention to the building. Now, the placement of the sculpture in front, Nicky's sculpture, Firebird, really brought focus to that corner, no question about it. And when we began designing the building, we didn't think about a piece of art being there because it wasn't part of the equation at the time. But once we got through the design process, we all collectively realized, if you could find a great piece of art, that corner would be good for it. However, when we were planning it, we put a fountain there, a water feature, not fully designed, but intended to perhaps occupy that space. The epiphany came when we flew to Atlanta Andreas Beckler and I and some others, to a show at the Botanical Gardens in Atlanta that had a Nicky de Saint-Phal exhibit. And that's where we saw the Firebird for the first time. And we were sort of taken aback. The scale of it was certainly monumental. The shape and form was, in a sense, classical, modern classical, derived from classical form. And the fact that it was mirrored and reflective made it almost three-dimensional, like it was moving, literally moving when light hit it. We sequestered in a wine bar while we were down there, had a bottle or two of wine, and said, we really need to bring this to Charlotte, and the rest is history.
David, I'd like to play a quick word association game with you and mention the names of certain people, and if you can give me your quick reactions as to the meaning and import you give them in your career. Frank Lloyd Wright.
The greatest.
Why?
There was no one like. Wright was not just a Renaissance man, he was a giant of the 20th century. He aligns himself, in my opinion, with Einstein, with Newton, Da Vinci, all at the same level.
And what makes his work so outstanding in that regard?
Because he never had an unoriginal thought in his entire life. Everything he did was his own. Every stroke he put on a piece of paper was unique to him. Other than the precedents he claimed he used, which was to some degree Mayan architecture and a few other classical references he would occasionally make, everything he did was his own idea.
And in some ways he reshaped all of 20th century architecture, did he not?
Well, in a sense, he didn't reshape it, but he put it on a path forward, is what he really did.
Mm-hmm. Pablo Picasso.
The same, a giant of the 20th century where every stroke was original and unique.
Alberto Giacometti.
Very thin.
Quite thin.
Quite thin. His forms were thin, and that has a certain uniqueness to me as a sculptor.
Italo Calvino.
Italo thought about, how should I say this? He was a writer who thought like an architect. He used visual references in his work. He looked at cities the way an architect or a planner might look at a city, and he would find a symbol or a story in a city as a writer. Not much different than the way an architect would find a symbol or a story in a piece of architecture. So his ability to figuratively and literally interpret the world that he lived in, primarily three-dimensionally, his stories and his writing inspired me.
Mario Botta.
I like Mario Botta. I think that Mario is an unsung hero of the legacy that Lou Kahn established and built. He worked for Lou Kahn very briefly in his early career, as he did Le Corbusier for a little while. But he walked away from both of those with much more admiration, in my opinion, to Lou Kahn and Lou Kahn's work. If you're not an architect, you probably never heard this, and if you've never heard of Lou Kahn, you wouldn't know this anyway. But Lou Kahn uttered one time, "Why do you like to use brick?" And he said something to the effect, "I ask a brick what it wants to be, and it wants to be an arch," which was an interesting response. That's paraphrased. I think if you look at Botta's work, he also asks bricks what they want to be, and he follows that pretty well.
Do you similarly ask the material that you work with what it wants to be?
No, I've never asked a single material what it wants to be.
Many of the artists you are drawn to are Italian. Why do you think that is?
Because the Italians were the Renaissance. They were the Renaissance. They were the greatest. Everybody else followed. The French, the British, the Germans, they all followed the Italians. And the Italians followed the Greeks, as you know.
Is there a place you go that renews your spirit as an artist?
I mean, other than my backyard?
Other than your backyard?
Museums.
Why?
Because they're filled with work that inspires and allows you to think differently about the world. Art is like a window to the world.
Explain.
When you look at a piece of art, you can see the world differently. You can see it dynamically, you can see it passively, you can see it aggressively, you can see it placidly. So art has the ability, in my parlance, or the way I think, that if you see a piece of art, when you look at it and how you look at it can reflect how you might consider designing a building, a Picasso is a good example. When Picasso did his line drawings, they were two-dimensional, but I see them as three-dimensional drawings, spaces you could actually walk inside of. And if you could turn a Picasso line drawing into a building, it would be fascinating. I mean, that's a simplistic way to respond to the question, but it still has resonance with me. That art inspires what I do. If you look at all the work I have done in Charlotte, or had the pleasure of working on in Charlotte, you will see that it is full of, or at least implied, if not literally or figuratively, color, art, form, shape. It does inspire my work.
Is there a museum that you are particularly drawn to return to?
Yes. Believe it or not, it's the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And why is that? First of all, it has a fantastic collection of art, as well as other things. And that's where I first entered a museum when I was younger. And every time I go to Pittsburgh, I go to the Carnegie.
Memories again, yes.
Memories again. Memories everything.
Yeah. David, I want to share with you a quote from the 20th century modernist architect Philip Johnson. The first quote is, "If architects weren't arrogant, they wouldn't be architects." Paraphrasing, he goes on to say, "There are no good, modest architects." Is Philip Johnson right?
Philip Johnson was a goofball. Let's put it straight up. No, he wasn't right. I think you don't necessarily have to have a projected, forceful ego to be an architect. You have to have an ego, but it doesn't have to play out publicly.
Johnson also gave this advice to architects: walk every day. Why do you think he said that?
Because walking energizes, and guess what? Dave Wagner walks almost every day. I agree with Philip on that point. No question about it. Walking is restorative.
One of the public spaces you designed is the Green. How would you describe the Green to those unfamiliar with it?
It is a place to visit, to sequester yourself from the noise around you. That was the way we designed it. That was our desire to achieve that. And you can have a passive or an active activity in the Green. It is 1 1/2 acres. And my model was Paley Park in New York, which is a pocket park between two buildings. Now the distinction is it's between two walls, and at the end of it has a waterfall. So if you step into Paley Park in New York City, if you go into that space halfway to 3/4 of the way, you no longer hear the street traffic. You only hear the water in front of you, which was a remarkable design, where sound effectively became the three-dimensional component of the space. What we did in the Green, we knew we couldn't do that, so we supplemented it with artistic interventions by putting art and landscaping and layers of places and activities within a single space. We felt we were able to accomplish or achieve that level of passive tranquility that is so hard to find in urban areas.
What would a visitor see or experience in the Green?
Peacefulness. We've been told by a number of people over the years it's their favorite park. And you ask the same question that you just asked, and they'll tell you it's a quiet place. You can seem to get away from things, but still find something to do. It's not like you're sitting in a bucolic woods somewhere. You're sitting in an urban space where you sense there's lots going on around you, but you can lose yourself in that space, both accidentally and purposefully.
This is an experience that one has, but what are the design elements that help create that experience?
Grass, natural materials, trees, art, light, water, all the same ingredients architects have been using for years. It's just a question of who knows how to read a menu, and we all should and try. It's how you put the ingredients together to get the result. We can all bake a cake. Some people can bake a cake better than others. Why? They seem to understand how to use the ingredients better for a different or better outcome. And here's where you asked earlier about, what inspires you? How do you think about a project? In a way, this association is you think about it like a menu of ingredients, parts and pieces, purposefully. How do I put enough sugar in with the flour, and so on, as you mix the ingredients together? What needs to be more than something else? This is where architecture takes time. This is where you have to be trained to think like an architect, much like you have to be trained to think like a doctor or a lawyer. Think through the process. How do you get to the result, and what's the path you take to get there? It's not all whimsy, and it's not all flippant. It has to be, at the end of the day, purposeful if you want to accomplish something that's better than something else, that's memorable. There are no memorable accidents. I don't think it's possible. You can't make a building that's memorable by accident unless you're really lucky. And I don't know many architects that are lucky. Most of the best and greatest architects that we look up to, that we refer to today, are very cognitive about the way they think through a process.
We've been talking about the green as a public space. There's a trend to create focal points and activity zones in open spaces to activate the public realm to keep people stimulated. What are your thoughts about the design process for public spaces? Does engaging the public in design make for better spaces, or does it potentially complicate what the designer or architect might think best?
It all depends who is responsible for distilling the information that they receive. And in this case, let's just say it's the architect or it's the urban designer. Public process is fine. It's good to hear what people think, especially about their community. So if you're building a public space in a community of tens of thousands of people, it's okay to ask, what do you really like to do other than walk on the sidewalk? If you had a park, what would you put in it? If you listen well, usually you will find 9 times out of 10, everyone says essentially the same thing. So you have to be a little careful then on how you fill the boxes with the information. You can't have a cornhole on every corner of a park, even though people like to play it. You could have a place where it could happen, but you can't let certain activities drive the outcome. The best thing about a public park is it doesn't have a program. How many public parks have you been into where it's nothing but trees, grass, and some seating, and it's perfectly okay, just the way it is? This is classic European park design. There were no activities in European parks, 0 activities. Open space, grass, trees, walkways, benches. That's it. You created the activity. If you wanted to go into a public park in Europe and throw a ball or play music, you could do it. Today, what we try to do is, let's find things for people to do in parks. And I find that an anathema to park design. And by the way, there's nothing to do in the green, but look at what we did. We placed art there for you to absorb and to look at. It wasn't there for you to have a separate activity. It was all part of the experience.
David, I have a book in my hand that you privately published for your family entitled A Dave Wagner Scrapbook of Miscellany, Ephemera, and Other Stuff and Stories Collected Over 25 Years with a Few of My Favorite Things. What is in it, and what motivated you to create it?
What's in it is miscellanea and ephemera that I've collected over a number of years, mostly out of magazines, articles, or things I've done, or things I found, or clippings. I have 12 additional binders in addition to that book. That's just a simple compilation. So why did I do that? There could be lots of reasons. I can tell you that I know and have followed certain designers who did the same thing. Paul Rand comes to mind, who's a famous graphic designer and sort of put the corporate identities together for IBM and UPS. And he was a great collector of stuff, objects and articles and books, and his studio was a mess. Similarly with Ivan Cheremayev, who was also a fantastic graphic designer. He was a collector, and you may remember him most if you follow this. He did an exhibit in Washington, D.C. in the early 1980s called Nation of Nations, and he put together all of the stuff that America had collected into a single exhibit and a timeline. Now, Smithsonian had been doing that for years. He kind of selectively picked things to give capsulization. And I always think about collecting things. When I was young, I collected things because I didn't have much to collect. I mean, it was things I found, boxes of stuff I would put together. And again, I do that because I continue to reference things that have inspired me. I'll give an example. Those of you who are old enough may remember when John F. Kennedy died. Well, when he died, I remember being in a classroom. An announcement came over the loudspeaker and said, "The President of the United States has just been shot. Everyone lay their heads down on the desk and be quiet." Teacher turned the light off in the room. Years later, I'm reading Esquire magazine, and there's an article by David Halberstam. And he wrote an article about the quiet elegance of JFK. And when I read the article, all I could think about was that day many years before when he was assassinated. And that's how I connect things together. It's kind of like a line through life. You know, you see something, you pull it out, because it reminds you of something else. And if you look at this book I made, it's all sort of memories of places and articles. I'll give an example. If I've been to a really cool place like Harry's Bar in Paris, my wife and I went, collected an article. I saw an article about Harry's Bar, and I tore it. It's a scrapbook. It's all it is. It's a scrapbook.
If there's a theme to your work and your life, it seems memory, and what is memorable is at the heart of it.
That's correct.
David Brooks, the columnist for the New York Times, wrote a column in 2010 entitled Trying to Live a Well-Considered Life. The column is included in your scrapbook. He talks about two paths in life, the well-designed or well-planned life. You think about your life in advance and create it intentionally. In the designed life, the self is paramount. Then there's the second path, the path he calls the summoned life, where you respond to the context and moment you find yourself in. The times summon you. In this life, the self is secondary to the moment that you find yourself in. What has been your path?
The second path, which is effectively, it's rising to the moment. The self-realized and self-considered life is not for everybody. It's actually hard to do. Other than the fact that at a very young age, as an example, why I like that article, because is for a number of reasons, but in well-considered life is this. At a very young age, I decided I wanted to be an architect. I never veered from that path, not a single time in 60 years. When I said at age 7 I wanted to be an architect, I tried to figure out how to be one. I didn't know what an architect did, but I was determined I was going to figure this out, and I did. So there's a purposeful life. Always wanted to be an architect. The other part of life is once you have determined what you want to be, then you can leave it and go another direction, because you're always going to be an architect because you put that aside. I am an architect. So then the question is, how do you have an alternate or parallel life where it's not so planned and it's more accidental, it's more surprising? And that's what is interesting about that article. I think you can lead a parallel lives, one that's perfectly planned and one that isn't so planned.
You have 4 children who are remarkably interesting and successful. Tell us about them.
I would summarize that best by saying their mother and my wife, Cassandra, was the guidepost, in that she understood then and understands now that communication and engagement are absolutely essential to a person's future success. The more you engage them when you're young, the more time you spend with them, the more care you give them, the more love you expend to them, actually makes a difference. Now, somebody else might tell you about, well, there are a lot of things. There are a lot of environmental issues. Genetics might have something to do with it. Personalities, you're born with one, or you're one type or another. But how do you build character? You build character through time and effort and consistency. And I think, to your question about we have 4 engaged children, it's because they have incredible character.
Can you tell us briefly about each?
Oldest daughter, Krista, Davidson graduate, master's degree in public planning and policy, a very successful consultant, very engaged in community affairs. A son who has a degree in history and religion, and he is now a self-employed video producer with a company that he's sort of built up and does great video work and is, again, very artistic. Our youngest daughter, Diana, is a RISD graduate in industrial design. She won the Norman Bell Geddes Award, which is the highest honor given to a student at RISD. She is now the senior functional apparel designer at the Weiss Center of Advanced Robotics at Harvard University. Our youngest son, John David, is an architect, and he is beginning his master's program at Harvard University this fall. So what I can say about our children is, if you are not prepared and you want to have dinner with all of our 4 children, you need to prepare before dinner, because it will be a pretty raucous evening with a lot of discussion about things you may not know anything about.
And finally, David, as we come to a close, what makes for a good life?
Having a belief system, persistence, a determination, continuity, care, appreciation, gratitude.
Thanks so much for your time today, David.
You're welcome. Good to be with you.
David Wagner is a principal architect at Wagner Murray Architects, an interdisciplinary firm that prizes originality and continuity. He has received wide recognition for the diversity and consistency of his designs. He is a graduate of the Virginia Polytechnic Institute College of Architecture and Inner College for Environmental Design, now known as the Virginia Tech University College of Architecture and Urban Studies. And now, a personal word. When I hear David speak about cities and memory and song, I'm reminded of the poem Chicago by Carl Sandburg. Hog butcher for the world, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and nation's freight handler, stormy, husky, brawling, city of the big shoulders. So the poem begins. The poem is the first that appears in his book Chicago Poems, published in 1916, that personified the city, giving voice to its landscape and defining Chicago ever since. In its muscular free verse, the poems celebrate the fierce and pugilistic terrain of the city. Sandburg speaks of the city as a tall, bold slugger, and how, by night, the skyscraper looms in the smoke and the stars and has a soul. Sandburg's meditations on his city of lifted head singing so proud to be alive and coarse and strong and cunning have become part of city lore, giving Chicagoans an origin myth and instructions on how to act. Every Chicagoan worth his or her salt weathers the cold and leans into the wind. Every Chicagoan gives nod to grit, toughness, and sinewy strength. Sandburg's elegies are in a long tradition of citizens giving personality to place. We see in the city a face and an intent. We see in it identity as unique as our own. We speak of its disposition, struggles, and achievements, giving cities characteristics of the human condition. The ancient Greeks believed that every place had its own consciousness, given form in the city goddess known as Tyche. Tyche was the presiding deity of cities and focus of city loyalty. During the Hellenistic era, Tyche was tangible to the common touch, impressed on local coins with a turreted crown, symbolizing the walls of the city and local feelings of security, welfare, and happiness. The cult of the city goddess brought pride of place to the polis. Capturing the complexity of local pride, Tyche was connected with both Nemesis and Agathos Daimon, the vexing and good spirits of interpersonal exchange. In medieval art, Tyche was depicted carrying cornucopias, a ship's rudder, and a wheel of fortune, presiding over the entire course of local fate. We see personification of place again in Rudyard Kipling's The Song of the Cities, in which the British imperialist has 19th century Bombay, Calcutta, Rangoon, Halifax, and other cities speak of their own qualities as tribute to the British realm. Cape Town dreams of one land under empire, from Lion's Head to Line. Each city is its own person, singing lyrics of colonial aspiration, all finding glory as individual subjects of Queen Victoria, with all irony lost. We personify those things with which we are in relationship. Places determine who we know and what we do, and therefore, to a large extent, who we are. Hundreds of popular songs are sung today about the cities we live in, from Randy Newman's Baltimore to Bruce Springsteen's Streets of Philadelphia. In L.A. Woman, Jim Morrison and the Doors personify the city of angels and embrace her in dark, magical tension. I see your hair is burning, hills are filled with fire. If they say I never loved you, you know they are a liar. Driving down your freeways, midnight alleys roam, cops in cars, the topless bars, never saw a woman so alone. We can imagine Morrison in the night and heat of Sunset Boulevard, and imagine ourselves too in love with the searing, yearning embrace of Los Angeles. We can imagine the flirtation of Hollywood, the beckoning of Santa Monica, the lies of Brentwood. We can imagine the city as a nubile starlet, as a reigning star, and as an aging movie queen ready for her all-too-strange and harrowing close-up. In all these instances, the city lives. It breathes, hurts, and offers salve. It churns, congests, and absorbs our confidences upon its warm asphalt skin. The city asks for toil, seduces desire, and leaves us let down. There is the angst and promise of place, mirroring our imperfections and all that we are. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Thank you to my partners Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.